Hello and welcome to the Inside Intelligence webinar series, brought to you by the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a discussion with Darryl Lansey on developing 21st century intelligence leaders. My name is Peter Huggins. I'm the event producer. Please note today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Inside Intelligence playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A function, and we'll get to as many of your questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn the presentation over to our moderator, Dr. Michael Ard, Program Director and Senior Lecturer for the Intelligence Analysis Program here at Johns Hopkins.
Thank you very much, Peter, and welcome everybody. Today we have with us Darryl A. Lansey, who was CIA's Director of Leadership Learning prior to his retirement in March 2018. He was responsible for creating and executing CIA's vision, guiding philosophy, and strategy for providing enterprise-level training for new supervisors to senior executives. Prior to leadership learning, he was the National Reconnaissance Office Chief and Deputy Chief Learning Officer. During Darryl's CIA career, he served in 4 of the 5 directorates, including more than 20 years in the then Directorate of Intelligence, which is now Analyses, where he authored and managed analysis on an array of topics, including chemical and biological weapons proliferation, counternarcotics, counterterrorism, and the Balkans. Upon Darryl's retirement, CIA awarded him with its Career Commendation Medal. Darryl, welcome to our program. We're looking forward to hearing your remarks on developing 21st century intelligence leaders.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm happy to be here, and I look forward to the presentation, but more importantly, the conversation after the presentation. So why don't we go ahead and get right into this. As Michael pointed out, this is developing 21st century intelligence leaders. Let me see. All right, here we go. So I thought it was, before I got into discussion of developing 21st century intelligence leaders, that I would start with a short bio of my own in terms of my leadership journey. And the reason why I do this is because I have some, I'll state up front, I have some biases in terms of leadership development. And those biases are a result of the experiences that I had as a new supervisor starting out in a leadership role. So I started my career, as Michael pointed out, as an intelligence analyst. And in approximately 14 years into my career, or June of 1999, I decided I wanted to become a first-line supervisor for 2 reasons. One, because that was the only way to get promoted up the ranks. And 2, I had an interest in helping others in their journey as analysts within the agency. Unfortunately, I only lasted 13 months as a first-line supervisor, and I will get into some more reasons why as the presentation goes on. But it took me after that, at 13 months, at the end of 13 months, I stepped down from my first leadership position. It took me another 2 years of self-reflection as to why I wanted to be in a formal leadership position and what I could bring to a role as a formal leader. There's the old adage, be careful of what you ask for, because 2 years after I stepped down, I stepped into a new leadership role. And at my promotion ceremony 2 years after that, the then Deputy Director of Intelligence walked up to me, put his arms around my shoulder and said, "I have a job for you." And he says, "I need you to go out to the Kent schools where they teach new analysts." He said, "I need you to go out to Kent School and start up first-line supervisor training again." And I said, as I just said, be careful what you ask for. 2 months prior to him suggesting I go out to the Kent School, I was in a meeting with the then director, and he was talking to a group of individuals such as myself in the DI. And he said, as he was talking a lot about the development of leaders in the Directorate of Intelligence. And I had numerous questions for that individual at the time and said, frankly, I think we're doing a poor job in developing new leaders. And as I said, be careful what you ask for, because him putting his arms around my shoulder was his way of saying, okay, put up or shut up. So I went out to the Kent School for 18 months, worked on a new supervisor course for the DI. It's important to note that the DI at the time had an attrition of individuals leaving the DI. There's a saying that people leave their bosses, they don't leave jobs. So part of my job in the Kent School was to develop leadership training to give new leaders in the DI the skill set and the knowledge in the hopes that it would stem the tide of people leaving the directorate, because again, people were leaving their bosses, not the Directorate of Intelligence per se. Again, I did that for 18 months. I then transitioned into a job back in the DI as a deputy director of the Analytic Method Center, where I was responsible for supervising 4 other supervisors as a manager, supervising 4 other supervisors, and in a unit that was focused on geospatial intelligence. I had statisticians, mathematicians, as I like to tell people, a lot of scary, intelligent individuals, as we were looking at methodologies to support the intelligence analysis process. I left that position and then went on to the CIA's Leadership Academy, where I became the program manager and the lead instructor for something called Managing and Leading Change in the Middle, which was a middle manager's course. I did that for 3 years. And in that process, I continued to hone my understanding of what leadership is and what leaders do. From that job, I ended up going to the NRO, as Michael pointed out in my bio, as the Deputy Chief Learning Officer. From there, the Chief Learning Officer, and then ultimately back into the job that I retired from, which was the Director of Leadership Learning. As I said, I mentioned my bio because my journey in being a leader was not easy. My journey in becoming a leader of the agency required a lot of self-reflection in terms of what does it mean to be a leader. Let me scroll down. And so in terms of developing 21st century intelligence leaders, we have explicit conversations in our courses, at least we did 6 years ago, and I believe they're still going on, the difference between what does it mean to be a leader versus managers and management. So leaders focused on people versus management focused on processes and procedures. And this is an important distinction, and sometimes they get muddied and muddled together because people serve in management positions, but are they managing the position, or are they actually leading? So are they really focused on the process and procedures, or are they focused on the people, or are they doing both? And we can have a conversation later if you have questions regarding that. Leadership, doing what's right versus doing things that are right, doing things the right way. This is the classic distinction that the leadership guru Warren Bennis came up with probably 50 years ago. But it's a good distinction to keep in mind because, again, leadership is about focused on people, and it is also doing what's right. Doing what's right for the individuals that you've been asked to lead, essentially your followers, but also doing what's right in terms of the organization. I have a definition here for leadership. It's actually a definition that I put together, but I will say this. There are literally thousands of definitions with regards to leadership. Leadership, as I could tell people, leadership and the definitions of leadership are similar to what former Associate Chief Justice, or former Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Potter Stewart, said about obscenity. People know it when they see it. That's similar to leaders and leadership. And again, we can have some more conversation about that. One of the things that I discovered and really came to realize as in my experience at the Kent School, after stepping down from my first supervising job 2 years before, was the fact that leadership and management and the parlance that we talk about in the intelligence business really are trade crafts. And what I mean it's a disciplined trade craft in that you really have to think about what are you doing. It's a skill in which you want to hone the skill, practice the skill, get feedback on the skill, and practice some more. and then practice the skill not only in a classroom setting, but on the line where the rubber meets the road. On the management side of things, management is the act of ensuring that tasks and missions get accomplished with a finite number of resources, personnel, money, and time, while making trade-offs between the task missions and to address shifting priorities. One of the things that we did explicitly in our leadership training was to have conversations around the new leaders that were being developed, as well as experienced leaders, of where is their focus in time? Or is their focus in time on managing the personnel, money, and resources, personnel, money, resources, and their time? Or is their focus on the people, or a combination of the two? I will say within the CIA, because the CIA is so mission focused, that a lot of the time that new leaders as well as experienced leaders spend is on the management side. They spend a lot of time in dealing with, and I don't mean this in a pejorative way, but in the bureaucratic administrivia, in the meetings and the day-to-day processing of paperwork, and sometimes lose track of the fact that their primary job, or one of their primary jobs, is to develop the individuals that they've been asked to or been put in charge of. And it's finding that balance between making the trains run on time and at the same time helping the people that you are been asked to lead. Yeah, I'm sorry, I lost my thought. Let me move on from here. So in terms of the intelligence curriculum, we on the leadership curriculum, we had explicit discussions about values. What are the differences between ideal values, personal values, and organizational values? The first leadership position I was in and I stepped down from, there was a disconnect amongst all of us in our ideal personal and organizational values. So much so that that unit that I stepped down from my first job became a 15-year-long case study that the agency used in its new supervisor training. But as a result of that incident, we had very explicit conversations in our classes about values, the difference between ideal values, organizational values, and personal values. Trust and trustworthiness is a common theme throughout all the courses, from aspiring leaders through first-line supervisors, middle managers, and executive leadership. What does trust look like? What does trustworthiness mean? We used a model that Stephen Covey and his son M.R. Covey developed. And Stephen Covey, if you all are familiar with the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, that's the model we use, and where trust is the Venn diagram between character and competence. You can have somebody who is extremely competent in what they do. A leader is extremely competent, but their character in terms of lacking integrity. And so is that somebody you want to trust? So we have very explicit conversations about trust. The other thing I will say about trust, and I asked an individual who I used to work with in preparation for this webinar about the current state of trust at the agency, CIA, what I know best. And this particular individual that I reached out to had spent a number of years doing informal surveys of his leadership classes in terms of what was or what is the state of leadership from a grade from A to F. Prior to my retirement in 2018, this individual, after talking to at least 1,000 different students, those students gave the agency a C- in terms of a grade. So I texted the individual, I said, what's the current state in terms of grades or trust level at the agency? And the answer was still C-. And to me, that's sad because the needle hadn't moved. And so and we can have maybe a conversation after my presentation in terms of what is involved in moving the needle and why the needle may not have moved. And part of it, as I would argue, is the difference between what people do in terms of their leadership focus and their management focus. Are they focusing on people or are they focused on mission? I like the military definition or the Army's definition, mission first, people always, and keeping that in mind. So we have explicit conversations about emotional intelligence. Are individuals self-aware, socially aware? How are they in terms of their relationship management? Typically, when you see leaders derail, they derail because of a lack of self-awareness, often because of a lack of humility, and finally is a lack of accountability. But that self-awareness piece, part of that emotional intelligence, is one of the key reasons why they derail. We had explicit conversations around communications. How do you communicate up, down, and to the side and peers? How do you tell truth? And I'll put truth to tell truth to power. And typically that means how do you communicate upward, sometimes with a difficult message that those above you may not be prepared yet to hear. We had explicit lesson plans on feedback and difficult conversation. The feedback model we use, and it's one that's simple and to remember: a situation, behavior, impact. We like that model because it was easy to remember and easy to execute. So just as an example, situation, Darryl is an example. Darryl, the other day in the staff meeting, you spent time talking over your fellow teammates. So the situation, team meeting, behavior, I was talking over my teammates. Impact, your fellow teammates didn't have an opportunity to share their thoughts on a particular topic. The SBI model we really liked because it kept things simple, easy for people to remember, and it kept it away from the emotions of the moment and focused on what was the situation, what was the behavior, and what was the impact. Talked about difficult conversations. How do you go about having difficult conversations? Collaboration was a key element. Our policymakers expect the sum of the parts being greater than the whole, and so, or the whole being greater than some of the parts. And so they wanted to know that the information they were getting was the best information as a result of a group of individuals, either at the CIA or across the intelligence community, collaborating on a point. I like to refer to it as co-laboring, because when it's done ideally, when it's done well and ideally done well, all the individuals who are participating are contributing their knowledge skills to the topic at hand. We had a lot of explicit conversations around managing conflict. Culture was really important. And the reason why we had discussions about culture is because is another old adage in management leadership. Culture eats strategy for lunch. Culture has so much of a day-to-day impact on leaders in the organization and how organizations function. And so having an explicit conversation around what does culture mean, and how does culture play out in the day-to-day lives of the leader. Negotiations. We had conversations around what is the negotiations. We explicitly taught win-win negotiations rather than zero-sum negotiations. The idea that with win-win negotiations, to teach people to focus on their needs versus their wants, and then within the negotiations, making sure that each party ideally is able to walk away from the negotiation with their needs met and not leaving any value for either side on the table. And then finally, continuous learning encouraged, because and here's a bias, to be a good leader, you're in a continuous learning mode of, well, what do I need to do? What skills do I need to do to hone and get better at? On the management curriculum, there was a lot of time on strategic thinking and planning, matching vision with resources and execution of the plan. Some of you may have heard the idea that vision without resources is a hallucination. And so you can have the best strategic thinking and planning in the world, But if you don't have a plan for execution, if you don't have the resources to execute, then that strategic plan, unfortunately, becomes what we used to call shelf fodder. In other words, it'll sit on the shelf and collect dust. So really teaching the students how to think strategically and plan strategically. Decision making. And here's a key one, and this goes back to analysis, but it becomes even more important in leadership roles, is understanding and recognizing and countering cognitive biases. Two of the biggest cognitive biases when you encounter as a leader, or even an analyst for that matter, but as a leader, are confirmation biases and sunk cost fallacy. And so from a confirmation bias, are you only paying attention to the information that fits your mental model of what you're expecting to occur? Or are you looking for other data, or looking at other data that may confirm or deny that? Sunk cost fallacy, and particularly on the management side, this is important, of throwing good money after bad, and not recognizing that when to pull the plug. Sometimes as a leader, it's hard when you and your team or your unit have put a lot of time, money, and effort into a particular project, and not recognize when that project may have gone astray. And you need to say time out, either let's regroup or kill the project. And so sunk cost fallacy. So teaching individuals, having explicit conversations around what do those cognitive biases look like. Having conversations and discussions around pre and post-mortems. In terms of pre-mortems, thinking about what are the likely end state of a particular action that you're trying to achieve, and playing out the scenario ahead of time before carrying out that particular action. And then post-mortems, after a particular event has occurred, did it go as you had expected? Did it go as the pre-mortem had played out? And then we have explicit conversations around tools that can be used in that decision-making process. Many of you are probably familiar with SWOT situation, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and looking at those four in the decision that you make. Or the 5 whys analysis, which is a good one. I'll give you a quick example. The Boeing 737 issue right now that's underway. So Boeing 737 crashed. Why did it crash? Problem with the software. Well, why was there a problem with the software? Well, was it really a problem with the software? Why was there a problem with the software? Well, there wasn't a problem with software. There was a problem with the implementation of the software. Well, why was there a problem with the implementation of the software? So the goal is to continuously narrow down, scope down or zero in on what were the actual causes, or the root cause. And this gets to some of the root cause analysis. What was the root cause of a particular action, by asking why? Systems thinking. This is particularly important at the middle management and the executive level, but it's also important for new supervisors as well. We spend a lot of time using a gentleman named Barry Oshry's work on systems thinking, and the workshop, or the simulation he developed, called the organizational workshop. It's an explicit simulation and system thinking about looking at an organization in terms of tops, middles, bottoms, and customers, and how do those individuals, the tops, the senior managers, the middles, and the bottoms, how do they interact on a daily basis? How do they interact with the customers? How do they address customer needs as the customers come into the system with their wants and needs? And how do those various components interact with one another and integrate with one another? Management curriculum in terms of plans and budget. Most importantly, learning how to acquire and spend money effectively and efficiently. And probably one of the best lessons I learned as a leader within the organization was from a senior leader whom I served as her executive assistant. And she said to me one time, she said, Darryl, if you don't remember anything else I tell you, remember this: learn how to acquire money, learn how to spend it. And that alone was probably the best lesson that I was able to ever to implement as a leader, because the CIA and certainly the intelligence community, but I can argue organizations in general, are a competition of ideas, and those ideas have to be resourced. And typically, those who are able to present their ideas in an effective manner and then resource those ideas are able to carry out specific missions that they have in mind. Next, contracting. And we would talk about explicitly about contract types, the role of the contract officer and the role of the contracting officer's technical representative, and then how do you get the best value out of contract. Where the intelligence community throughout my career increasingly went, certainly I'll say CIA increasingly went from having all the expertise it needed on site to hiring contractors for specific expertise. Most importantly, though, when you hire a contractor, understanding what kind of contract vehicle do you want in order to maximize the value that you're getting for the government. And then again, continuous learning encouraged within the curriculum. The last thing I will say is the agency, CIA, and certainly the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office, where I was Chief Learning Officer, they are, I would tell folks, they're like set up like the federal government and federal, state, and local government. There's an overall, as the CLO, of the NRO, I was the titular head of learning at the NRO. But within the NRO university, which I led, there were offices and directorates that also were responsible for developing or developing training and learning opportunity for their people. And so they often would come to the NRO university, or even my last job, leadership learning, for specific content that they were interested in, let's say strategic planning content. Once they got that content, they then went back and then contextualized that content for their particular group of individuals that they were responsible for. So just a quick example, we may have taught strategic planning, the process of how do you conduct a strategic plan, how do you build a strategic plan. But strategic planning in the context of being an analyst is different from strategic planning in the context of planning classified operation overseas. And that itself is different from strategic planning in the context of building a large system like a satellite. So it was explicitly having a conversation around, okay, here's the content. How do we now contextualize that content? So the pedagogy, which is a fancy word of saying, how do we teach all of this? Brief lectures to introduce a topic. We try to not be the sage on the stage. And it was really focused on the idea that our students were adult learners. How do we maximize the wisdom that resides in the crowd? Now, for the new supervisors or those who are aspiring to be supervisors, there was more, what I would say, sage on the stage pedagogy, because these were students who were just starting out in their leadership career. As we moved into the middle management and senior management, the wisdom really did reside in the crowd. Even though I had spent time as a middle manager, senior manager, there were people in the classroom that had just as much experience or more. And so how do we get those students to own the content and in some cases help develop the content? As I mentioned just now previously, the idea of content and context. How do we provide content and then contextualize it for each group, or each class student have their ability to think, okay, so how do I use the lessons I just learned, either leadership lesson or management lesson, how do I contextualize that? for the unit that I'm responsible for. Small team discussions and exercises. We really focused and spent a lot of time on, so in the case of small team discussions and exercises, a typical one was, how do you plan for a difficult conversation? And then that would transition into an actual role play between two individuals having a difficult conversation. So the students had an opportunity to plan for the difficult conversations in small groups, getting advice and thoughts from their fellow students, and then role playing that difficult conversation that they wanted to have. Sometimes a difficult conversation may have been a difficult conversation they wanted to have with their spouse. It didn't have to be a conversation that was a work-related conversation. And that was that exercise alone was often well received, because we really don't teach, or let's say it differently. Most people do not know how to have a difficult conversation, and so having explicit plan for having that conversation and then opportunity to practice before actually having it goes a long way. Simulations, we use simulations frequently, especially in the middle management and the senior executive ranks. Again, the work that Barry Oshry did in CN systems and system thinking, the tops, middle, bottoms, and customers exercise, that was an entire morning simulation in which students were in the role either a top, middle, bottom, or customer, and each there were 5-day weeks within the 5-day weeks within the simulation. Each day was 12 minutes long, and so we had students. It was like a beehive of activity, students moving around the room and trying to accomplish particular tasks and missions within a 12-minute day in order to address a customer need. The pedagogy in terms of practice, encouraging everything we did. How do we take the theoretical and turn it into practical? I'm a big fan of something called deliberate practice, in which as the students are practicing, there's a keen focus on what are they doing in the moment and giving them feedback in terms of how they can change their particular behavior to improve on it. So it's really focused on the skills in the moment by skilled practitioners who are giving the feedback. And finally, we are using use of psychometric instruments and coaching. Psychometrics instruments, fancy way of saying we used everything from self-assessments like the Myers-Briggs self-assessment to 360 feedback from a variety of vendors. The goal in the psychometric instruments was to for students to be able to see, especially from the 360s, how their peers and their subordinates and their bosses, what did they think about those individuals in terms of their strengths and weaknesses? Where did they need to improve? So a good example was one of the instruments we used was something called the conflicts dynamics profile. That profile really is focused on how are individuals in terms of addressing a conflict situation. Are they conflict averse or are they not? And how does that, from that feedback, how does that play out in terms of their interactions with, again, their peers, their subordinates, or their bosses? The sources for the curriculum content as of 2018, there was no prescribed D&I curriculum. It varied by the IC organizations. At the time, there were 17 organizations. Now there are 18 with the addition of the United States Space Force. And it depended on the organization, it depended on the context as well. The other thing with regards to the content was generally reserved for that particular organization's personnel. In other words, typically, CIA did not have its leadership courses open to other members of the IC community. One of the things I explicitly did when I was at the NRO and I was the chief learning officer is I opened up all of our curriculum to the entire IC. If we had even though, so first customers or first set of students were NRO personnel, whether civilian or military, but any additional seats that were open were explicitly made available to the IC at free of charge. I think at that time, the NRO was the only organization of the 17 IC organizations that did that. And I did it from the perspective of the concept and the idea of talking earlier about collaboration. How are we going to collaborate better if we don't know what goes on in the various IC organizations? If our students, let's say at the NRO or the CIA, all they know is the CIA, how can we expect them to go out and collaborate across the IC if they don't have a sense what those other organizations do? In terms of the curriculum content, we had a practice of either build it on our own internally using our own instructional system designers and instructors getting together to build that content. We borrowed the content. And so, for example, if at CIA, if DIA or NSA or NRO had a leadership course or a management course that we thought fit the needs of our students, instead of building it, we borrowed that content and with the permission of that particular organization and then implemented it. If we were unable to build it or borrow it, we would then buy it and license the best-in-class content. So a good example of that is the Stephen Covey work and his son, M.R. Covey, their work on trust and their work on the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. The 7 Habits course, we licensed the course, we got our instructors certified, and then we offered the course and whether it was at the NRO, a CIA, or the National Counterterrorism Center, the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People was always a very popular course. So thinking about the challenge and opportunities ahead for the 21st century leaders, the first challenge and opportunity I see out there is the rise of AI. I think the rise of AI is going to be a challenge for all of us. So I think it's going to especially be a challenge for the intelligence community leaders. Open source analysis, for example. So it's a double-edged sword. AI in terms of open source will give intelligence analysts and intelligence leaders an incredible opportunity to sort through millions and millions of pages of paper paper and information and data points and organize that information in ways that we've never been able to do before. And at the same time, analysts and leaders in the community are going to have to say, is the information that we're getting, is it genuine information, or is it information that an AI has created to shift our perspective on a particular topic? And so I think the rise of AI, like I said, I think it's an opportunity in terms of our ability to sort through information, but also a challenge as from the perspective of, is the information that we're seeing, is it genuine information or not? The next one, generational tensions. I think generational tensions have long been a topic within the intelligence community. And when I first came into the CIA, I had mentors who were born in the 1930s and 40s. They were from the traditional generation. I was a tail-end baby boomer, and there were clashes. Same thing is occurring now. So I don't think the generational tensions are necessarily new. But I will say there, again, in every generation, the topics are a bit newer. So for example, I think Generation Z / Alpha, they grew up in a time where collaboration was normal for them. They've been collaborating since the time they were in preschool. And truly co-laboring with one another, and it's not something that's abnormal to them. The topics of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. Again, I think in the latter generations, whether it was in their schools or the projects they were working on in college, having a diverse group of individuals, culturally diverse, racially diverse, genderly diverse, neurologically think the way they think neurologically, think and process informationally diverse. That's been part and parcel of their work, again, since they were kids. But that isn't necessarily the way previous generations have had to work. And so I think that how that plays out, and from a leader's perspective, how do you manage those tensions, and so that those generations are actually able to function with one another. And then finally, the political tensions. So I came into the intelligence community under during the Reagan administration. One of the things that the Reagan administration did was sign Executive Order 12333. That executive order lays out explicitly what intelligence officers are able to do and not do. Particularly with regards to the American public and things like political assassination, et cetera. Prior to President Reagan signing 12333 in the 1970s, we had the Church and Pike commissions that were set up to address specifically CIA's, for lack of better words, bad behaviors being set up. The tensions that are, and then not only setting up, addressing those bad behaviors, but setting very clear rules of engagement moving forward in terms of what's the role of, say, the CIA and the IC domestically versus in the foreign field. And there's very clear guidance of, the FBI handles intelligence, domestic collection of domestic intelligence. The CIA and IC is responsible for collecting intelligence overseas. I put here political tensions because depending on the elections, individuals may come in and say, hey, let's jettison 12333, or what's the role of that came out, the roles and responsibilities that came out of the Church and Pike Commission, do those need to be revisited in terms of freeing up what the IC and the can and cannot do both domestically and overseas. That's all I have.
Darryl, thank you very much. Yeah, if you don't have to share, but
Okay.
yeah. And we'll get to some questions. I had a few for you before we get started from our audience. And thanks for that great presentation, and also your experiences that went behind it. One of the things I wanted to ask about, and this gets back to the probably an age-old question, is or even intelligence community leader is a manager, is principally a really good manager, and probably doesn't get to be a leader until he or she has become a very good manager. Is there really a way to separate these two things?
Separating leadership from management?
Right.
Well, my short answer is no. To do it well, you need both the people skills and the ability to take care of the day-to-day resource issues, managing money, managing contracts, and the like. And all management, as I said, is about process and procedures, but those process and procedures have people behind them. And so how you interact with those individuals, how you treat them, and how you encourage them goes a long way, I would argue, in terms of how well those process and procedures are carried out. And so I think they're part and parcel of one another to do it well.
Another thought I had listening was, and getting to the question of leadership, building trust, which I thought was an extremely important point. Also, but what about inspiration? When we think about leaders, I think we go to people who've inspired us, and how did they do that, and why? What have you seen in looking at leadership from an intelligence community's perspective in terms of how a leader inspires its workforce?
So, as I said in the beginning, I'm biased, so not everyone's going to agree with maybe what I'm about to say, but I think one of the more inspiring leaders that I had in the course of my career was John Brennan, who was the director of CIA under the Obama administration. And the reason why I say John Brennan, because John explicitly walked the talk every day. And he walked the talk in terms of his expectations of the leaders that were under him. He walked the talk in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. He walked the talk in terms of his expectations of excellence. He walked the talk in terms of being open to conversations from essentially people like me occasionally telling truth to power. And, there was always a way to do that. And so the message was received. But for me, I put him as an inspirational leader because he consistently walked the talk. I mean, if he said he was going to do something, he did it. And he also, lastly, he did something I think was very hard but necessary: the modernization of CIA that occurred in 2015. He took a lot of flack from the workforce and some of his middle managers and even his executive team with regards to modernization. But John realized that the agency really needed a transformation, and how we looked at the world, how we interacted with one another, and how we trained individuals in terms of being leaders. So, again, I'd say John Brennan and is a good example of that.
And that transformation was based on a center system.
Correct.
That I just want to make sure that our listeners are clear on that. Building off old functional centers that we had.
And actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because again, I have biases. I grew up in the equivalent of two centers, counternarcotics and counterproliferation. And the center concept, you bring together all the expertise that resides across the agency. So analysis, operations, digital, science, technology, and administrative, and in one shop. And then that center is able to interact with the rest of the agency and the IC using the expertise it has. And so I'm, again, my bias, but I think that model worked really well.
Last question for me, and this is something we were discussing before we came on the air, was that I didn't know this until we were talking, that both of us had spent some time in recruitment. And I wanted to ask you, when you were recruiting, what was your experience? Were you thinking about that you were trying to find the future leaders of the intelligence community while you were recruiting? And what were you looking for?
Sure. So I had some criteria that I had to follow. There was the organizational criteria, and I had Darryl's criteria. And one of the things that I explicitly was looking for were individuals who were had a deep sense of curiosity, because I don't think you can be an intelligence officer, especially being an analyst, unless you have a deep sense of curiosity. In individuals who, even though they may not have had the highest GPA in the world, what did they do? What sort of resilience did they have? What struggles did they overcome to get to where they were in their journey? I'm trying to think kind of what else. So it's curiosity, their resilience, critical thinking. I am a bias, but I think critical thinking is a skill that is not taught well in a lot of universities, and it's a skill that is missing even as people are being recruited into the intelligence community. And You know, so how did they process information? How did they process a scenario? Did they understand their own biases? And did they do the meta thinking? Did I get some indication of did they think about how they were thinking as they were processing information?
Thanks. I'm going to get to a couple of questions that we
Sure.
have in the Q&A now. And Kelly asks, did your curriculum recognize different levels of leadership or styles of leadership, such as direct, organizational, strategic? And did you differentiate that in the pedagogy that you developed?
So yeah, so we did, especially in the curriculum for aspiring leaders and supervisors, talk about the various forms of leadership. You know, what is, if I understand the question correctly, you know, what is, you know, difference between transactional leadership and transformational leadership? You mentioned earlier, Michael, that, you know, I think it was along the lines of people inspiring in leadership. Are people born as leaders, or are they developed as leaders? And so, you know, explicit conversation around the great man theory or great woman theory, people are born with leadership skills versus those who are, you know, who are developed. And so, yes, we had explicit conversations around types of leadership and what do they look like and how do they play out within organizations?
Getting back, there's another question Kelly raises. We're just talked about recruiting, and the idea when we're recruiting or even when we're managing. Okay, let's make this more of a managing.
Okay.
What do we do with these analysts who are these sort of odd ducks, as he put it, these kind of quirky geniuses that you have that maybe don't conform that well. Maybe they don't necessarily play well in the sandbox, but they're out of the box thinkers. They have outstanding critical thinking skills and imagination, et cetera. How do we manage people like that?
Trying to play to ideally to their strengths. There's nothing wrong with being quirky. Maybe at some point in my career, I was probably described as quirky. I worked with a lot of, as I said, scary, smart individuals, and we try to play those individual strengths, and part of playing to their strength is what are they good at, and how can they best help the mission given what they're good at. But with regards to the quirkiness, and you know, we recognize beginning in the early 2000 era that sometimes those quirky individuals who were fantastic analysts, who were fantastic scientists, did not need to be leading other people. And so, particularly in the Directorate of Intelligence now analysis, in 2000, the year 2000. The agency and the DI and then the Director of Intelligence created the senior analytics service track. And so we had analysts who could go from entry level to senior executive level being an expert. They never had to move into management or a formal leadership position in order to move through the organization. And that alone, well, one of several things that the agency did and the DIDA specifically did went a long way of playing to the strengths of those individuals who were quirky geniuses who could do things with data that no one else could do, but not necessarily putting them in charge of other people because likely they would do more damage than good because they were focused on themselves, or they micromanaged the process because they were so good at being, say, a data analyst, they wanted to tell other people how to do their jobs.
Right. I mean but they're essential to any operation, especially one I think in the intelligence community where you have a lot of frankly high IQ, high achievement people who sometimes don't suffer fools gladly, and you have to keep that, and you somehow have to manage and work all together as a team
And the other thing I would say there is, and you hear a lot these days about neurodiversity. Those individuals like strike me as being neurodiverse, because honestly, I think I worked with individuals who were on spectrums of neurodiversity, but we needed their abilities and skills and knowledge in order to carry out the job. And so it's really, how do you work with each person as an individual to maximize their strengths for themselves and the organization.
And I'm going to Chile ask a question about vision. So how do you convey that, as a leader? How important do you think that is for leaders in intelligence organizations to really convey a vision and direction?
It's extremely important, because I think people want to know where are we going, and not only where are we going, how is what I'm doing currently tied into where we're going. And one of the people that I enjoy reading is the author Daniel Pink, and Daniel Pink's book Drive. He talks about the three things that drive people is autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And the purpose, people want to know the why. And Simon Sinek is another one. His book Start With Why. But people really want to know, okay, what direction are we going and why are we going there? And within that, why should I get out of my bed every morning at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock and come in to follow that particular vision in that particular direction? And then ultimately, how do I fit in? And then the last two, in terms of, you have the purpose, but the autonomy and mastery. Now that I know the direction we're going, give me where it makes sense, give me the autonomy to do my job to help fulfill that vision. And then with mastery, give me opportunities to hone my skills such that I can help you, the leader, carry out that vision even better, or more effectively and efficiently, to save time, money, and energy.
Thanks.
Sure.
I want to thank Darryl for being with us today. And also, I want to mention as well, if you'd like to learn more about some of Darryl's experiences and leadership theories, I also invite you to check out his memoir, which is Between Love and Hate, right, Darryl? Is that?
It's called A Thin Line Between Love and Hate.
A Thin Line Between Love and Hate, which I enjoyed reading, and I think you will too. And I hope that you enjoyed our presentation today. Look forward to having you back. I will be doing, we're trying to schedule something again for May, and we have a project coming up in June where we'll be talking about intelligence and weapons of mass destruction with one of our faculty members, Robert Clark. So we're looking to have those two for you down the road. But in the meantime, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on our webinar in Inside Intelligence.
Thank you for having me. Have a good day, everyone.